So I'm inviting our next speaker. It's Lucija Balikić from CEU. She'll be presenting her paper on serving Slavdom, Southern Slavic Sokolmembers in public office and the politics of dualism. Lucija, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dasha, and thank you to all the organizers. It was a really nice idea to have this conference, and I really appreciate it. Especially opportunity to talk about Sokol some more. So let me share my screen, and let me go back, or actually we can stay here. So for those of you, although I'm quite sure that most of you know, but still for those of you who don't, Sokol was a mass civil association for physical culture of Slavic nationalities in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and beyond. It existed roughly from 1860s until the Second World War, and also obviously beyond our monarchy. It also existed in Russian Empire, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and the US. Focus of my today's presentation will be on those civil servants who were active members in any Southern Slavic Sokol association in the monarchy, but I'm focusing mostly on late period of the monarchy, so roughly from the turn of century until the beginning of the First World War. And I studied biographies of around 60 such civil servants, again, in all realms of the monarchy where they existed. And I studied two main elements. One was social political background, so potential party affiliation, religious adherence, family milieu they came from, ethnic or national ambivalences they might have had, places of their education and socialization, and of namely their vocation. Also, I studied very much their intellectual output. So I did a conceptual analysis of which main concepts were they using, in which meanings exactly. I tried to map what kind of political ideologies they had affinities towards, and what kind of scientific careers they had, if they had. And the main questions for that I posed for this research are how can their strategies of navigating the life between the public office and so-called activism explain the complex boundaries between state and civil society? So something that we've been hearing a lot in this conference. The second was what do the difference between these strategies among Cisleitanian and Transleitanian actors tell us about the differences in their respective political cultures and mass nationalist mobilizations they're at. So this was very important for me, the notion of different political cultures. So just for those of you who might not be so familiar with Sokol, here is just some visualization of their massive gatherings, also of their involvement of women and their gym, and what was their aesthetics like. So I was really struggling to define political culture for this particular research and for my dissertation in which I'm dealing with Sokol. So here are some sketches. For this context, I find the most appropriate, the comprehensive and holistic definition by Ernst Hanisch from Universität Salzburg, which he provided in his 2005 book, where he inquired into political mentality acquired via historical traditions supported by political symbols. I am aware that due to his research, in light actually of his research on Austrofascism, this could have a certain Sonderweg tilt, and I understand if you would criticize me for that, we can maybe refer to this in the discussion. He argued that Cisleitanian political culture was marked by Catholicism and modernizing trends primarily being initiated from above, and civil society always being dependent on the state. He described it as a culture of subjects, stressing the sharply hierarchical structure of Austrian society, also in the long delay. And also he stressed formality of interpersonal exchanges, emphasis on rank, observance of consensus, pompousness, theatricality of public occasions, phrasemongering, cultivation of personal contacts with officialdom, and submissiveness of citizens. He concluded that retreat and defeat of political liberalism had already begun when modernity, quote unquote, in culture arose in Austria. And that's where his assertion of this post-liberal political culture among youth comes from. And this is something I find very relevant for my study of Sokol in this period. So I also wanted to, of course, reflect on Hungary and how is it different. I was basing this on the text by Lawrence Cole on Visions and Revisions of Empire, where he was problematizing the diverging experiences of democratization between the dual realms. Of course, he focused on the anti-Habsburg strains in the Hungary's political culture, and also the influence it received from the independent-minded Calvinist and Lutheran gentry of Eastern Hungary and Transylvania, which he also developed into some kind of class mentality of the political elite. Also kind of exemplified by this saying that politics is the matter of gentlemen, right? A politica urak dolga, which he sees as justification of authoritarian tendencies in implementing legislation and anti-democratic practices on the ground, as mainly those such as, exclusion of peasantry, different non-Magyar nationalities, social democrats, and modernist youth counterculture from the decision-making process, or democratic process in general, right? And I also found quite illuminating the contribution by Bálint Varga in his very recent article, Two Faces of Hungarian Empire, where he demonstrated that there were actually two different concepts, or two different main meanings of the concept of empire in the Hungarian political discourse in late 19th, early 20th century. The first one denoting a composite nation state and based on the historic right of the crown of St. Stephen, and the second one, which would be more like Magyar Birodalom, had anti-modernist imperialist tendencies towards Southeastern Europe more broadly, and advocated for a maritime turn in foreign policy, and was constructed by a nationalist elite, which I think has quite some influence on how also Sokolmembers defined key concepts such as nation states, empire in conversation with the ones, for example, that were dominant in Budapest. The next one that I thought would be useful would be to just give a brief overview of Habsburg civil servants in historiography, especially that one which kind of talks about limits of this, where the state ends and civil society begins. So I found very inspiring Rox and John's Forging a Multinational State, right? Where they talk about evolution of Homo Austriacus Magistratus. So how the constitutional government emerged out of the gradual building process in which administration played an integral part, and thus Austria's political arena, by definition, housed political competition within the institutions of the state, which again we can read in the Sokol story. Of course, they also provide analysis of various attempts at reforming the institution of governance on multiple levels, shifting responsibilities between different levels of government. There is obviously this famous Körber's plan in that context, which I would just briefly like to quote their statement about it, where they say that districts and counties would be outfitted by representative assemblies of elected delegates. They would take over many of the autonomous features of government, leaving the crown lands to manage funds, but little else. Political interests would be pushed down to the counties and districts, which would be smaller, nationally homogeneous, and less likely to devolve into national conflicts. This is something I find crucial for the way Sokolmembers were able to actually instrumentalize local levels of government to further their own agenda and to establish a certain cooperation in, we could even say, in transperipheral terms. The idea of most of these reform attempts was to decentralize administrative work, depoliticize, especially in terms of nationality politics, the work of the state, to liberate the administration from damage of national hatred. And I think this exactly contributed to Sokolmembers being able to do what they did, which I will show just a second later. So a few other things that inspired me in historiography were Limits of Loyalty by Lawrence Cole and Daniel Unowski, where they problematized the notions of Gesamtmonarchie, Reichspatriotismus, and Kaisertreue, asking, how far these ostensibly loyalist cadres resisted the blandishments of the rising national campus. And my answer would be they really didn't. And I will show you later my main findings, which show that really in some cases it was there was absolutely ambivalent question of somebody's loyalty to the Habsburg state. And this was also in conversation with Peter Hanak's Garden and the Workshop, where he talks about this parallel action, right? Which for me makes a lot of sense in the Sokol context again. And one of the last things in this Austrian context that I would like to mention is this Habsburg civil service and beyond, bureaucracy and civil servants from format to the interwar era, relatively recent publication, right? Which concluded that governmental structures seem to have been more dynamic and adaptable than previously thought, and that there was a growing popular demand for new services on the part of the state, and the relationship between governmental authority and the citizenry fundamentally changed due to increasingly variegated civil society, political parties, and interest groups. And I also think that in some way, yes, this can be said. On the other hand, we can also say that this maybe also helped them to civil society to become another pole or another center around which this communication could be organized, or this kind of projection of political needs could be discussed, and driving, going away from what state can offer at all. So, and of course, Peter Judson's idea of everyday empire was also very useful for me in this context. So to go to Hungary a bit, I really enjoyed the comparison provided by Gary Cohen in his seminal articles, where he compared mass politics, nationalist mobilization, public spheres, and associational culture vis-a-vis the state, where he argued that Austria's constitutional culture was mainly based on the concept of Rechtsstaat, and where electoral reform eventually succeeded by introduction of universal suffrage, and also that more negotiations were held and more concessions were given to different territorial entities, which he exemplified by Moravia and Galicia. He also said that greater autonomy was given to diets and counties, and there was generally more freedom of press and association. And also there were different language policies, by which he exemplified by the introduction of the concept of Umgangssprache, which allowed a kind of ambivalence, which was not, And in Hungary, he said that constitutional culture was based mainly on the sovereign state authority. Electoral reform eventually failed, and also that it was anyway, the electoral process was based on continuous gerrymandering against minorities and lower classes, that there was less autonomy for local diets, and policies were implemented towards creating a unitary Hungarian state. There were constant assimilatory language policies, and he claimed that there was more severe surveillance and policing, and there was stricter regulation regarding press and associational freedoms, whereby most nationalist activities were understood as anti-state. And I also had a look at Gabor Egri's new publication on regional elites, nationalist politics, and local accommodations, center-periphery struggles in late dualist Hungary, where I think what could be applicable to my case was this idea of building the empire from below in the context of center-periphery relations in both realms of the monarchy, where Hungary was reconceptualized as a nation state, so actually brought into question. And now finally for my own arguments. So I would like to first say something about the social political background of the actors. First about Cisleitania, I didn't, just like a small disclaimer, I didn't study Sokols in the imperial metropole just because I didn't have that many sources, honestly, and ability to go to the archives. So this is only from the periphery, quote unquote. So it's interesting to find out that significant number of Sokol members were engaged in the work of local municipalities, mainly cities or counties, crownlet diets or Reichsrat or political parties, but most interestingly, these were mayors. And here are some main vocations among the ones that I studied. So they were either sports or gymnastic trainers, lawyers, teachers, there was even one diplomat, translators, pedagogues, there was one Catholic priest, several poets and writers, painters, historians, and merchants. But I bolded teachers because they were the most numerous, but also lawyers and and so on. They were educated in the centers you would have guessed, so Ljubljana, Prague, Vienna, Graz, Fiume, Trieste, and Rome. And in most of their biographies, it is visible that actually educational institutions are the main places for their recruitment. So most of them get recruited to Sokol when they study, for example, law in Prague or Vienna or Graz, and then they come back to the imperial periphery and continue or found their own chapters of Sokol, or they join the existing or revitalize the existing one. So this is something that has been the case almost in every biography. And I also wanted to do a cross section of what other clubs they belong to. So I took special care of that. So they belong mostly to the Austrian Cyril and Methodius Society, or to different kinds of Southern Slavic student societies in the imperial metropoles or in the university centers. And interestingly enough, many of them belong to the Chamber of Commerce in Ljubljana. So in Transleitania, where I studied just Croatia, Slavonia, Banat, and Bačka, although there was Sokol in Budapest, but again, I somehow didn't find enough sources about them. So there is general inclination towards Croatian-Serbian coalition, obviously, but rarely we see members who are, who participate in city councils, municipal government, Croatian Diet, Hungarian parliament, or any political parties, except 3 of them, which are not that notable: Srđan Budisavljević, Milan Pilar, and Jure Vrbanić. Again, in terms of vocation, most of them are sport or gymnastic experts and trainers, scientists. This is a really important one. So we see a lot of medical doctors, but also chemists, for example, science popularizers. They are historians, physicians, biologists, anthropologists, chemists. We see a lot of lawyers, teachers, one actor, zoologist, museum curator, even a police officer, architect, translator, theater intendant, several bankers, writers, and an opera singer. They were educated in Vienna, Zagreb, Graz, and Prague. And in terms of the cross-section with other associations, they belong to the singing choir Kolo, which is interesting, various expert associations, especially in terms of natural sciences, and also several of them work in the Slavia Bank. Okay, I see I have 3 more minutes, okay. And also they belong into sobriety and abstinence societies. Just a sec. And in terms of Bosnia and Herzegovina, so we only can talk about Serbian Sokol because it was the most dominant. Actually, Muslims didn't really join Sokol, and there was no Croatian Sokol there that much. So in this period, at least. So they had a direct link to the Sokol from the Kingdom of Serbia, and they were mostly teachers, merchants, and physicians from Tuzla, Mostar, and Priboj. They studied in Vienna and Graz, and they were also members of Red Cross, which is interesting, Narodna odbrana, Prosvjeta, Chamber of Commerce for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and one of them was politically engaged he was a member of Diet in Bosnia, that was Atanasije Šola. So here I just put this picture for you to see that actually, for example, donations for the big Sokol gathering that took place in Zagreb was given not just by certain very exposed individuals, but also by local municipalities, right? So we see here the county, of Delnice, or the city of Ivanić-Grad, or the city of Karlovac. So actually money was channeled from these local municipalities to this kind of cause. So that's very interesting. And I will briefly go through the intellectual output as I don't have much time. So what they are talking about is many activities of Sokol. They talk about methods of gymnastic exercise, scientific research, hygienic initiative and suggestions, and reaction to the political issues of the day. And also they talk about history of sport and gymnastics, raising the cult of old Greece in particular, and very importantly, women's exercise. In terms of symbolic geographies, they introduce innovative elements such as Yugoslav space or Slavia, which is understood as European space inhabited by Slavs. And in terms of key concepts of political modernity, they refer to the national army. They talk a lot about intelligentsia, which they deem responsible for societal progress and call upon to join Sokol and accuse them of avoiding national activism all the time. And also they talk about democracy, which is a virtue that only exists in this kind of horizontal Sokol association, as opposed to the state and society, which are deeply entrenched in various hierarchies. And in terms of dualism, so it's interesting that they see difference between Cisleithanian and Transleithanian branches in the sense that those, for example, in Dalmatia are seen as national political organization, while the one in Zagreb is only devoted to systemic physical exercise. So we could, unpack a lot from this observation. And of course, they also talk a lot about Slavism. So they use the symbolism of the queen bee, of the Slavic quote-unquote linden tree, and ethnogenetic stories, paradigmatic failures like Kosovo battle. I will not read out this example now because there is no time, but so they also talk about this hero man, Čovjek Junak, especially in the Serbian context, who seems to be a kind of a precursor of the Cvić Dinaric man, who is kind of a heroic racialized Yugoslav fighting against his enemies and foreign domination. He is, of course, environmentally determined and is kind of always an entry point to develop some kind of national characterology of Yugoslavs. They also display language of health decline, concern for hygienic and social standing of the Yugoslav peasantry. And in terms of nationhood, I just wanted to highlight that it absolutely subsumes all other social and political issues. And they conceptualize Sokol as being outside of politics and something of purely national concern. But they also frame competing national movements, namely German and Italian, as their opponents in the political arena, which is seen as a zero-sum game. So it's kind of a paradoxical understanding. Here is just Alphonse Mucha's famous depiction of one of these kind of Slavic or rituals based on Slavic symbolism. So in terms of the women's question, let me just see if I have any. Okay. They write against prejudices regarding women's exercise. They argue that they represent medieval type of thinking and that modern women know exercise contributes to healthy and beautiful body. They also problematize several social constructs around femininity and masculinity. There is a quote for you here also, which kind of proves that they are rethinking these issues. They talk a lot about heredity, which is tied into the question of women's exercise. Women are presented to be the first one on the biological bumper of the nation, and thus they represent national capital and should be nationally thinking. This is also mentioned in the context of language purification and teaching children Slavic versions of various otherwise German words. And their references to the state are full of criticism for bureaucratic inefficiency, fabricating public opinion, tolerating Hungarian imperialism, and generally paralyzed parliamentary life, and the inability of party politics to solve social issues, especially in regards to Slavic nationalities. State reacts to this, by not issuing approval for their gatherings, by not providing space for their gyms, and competing movements also respond. So they have, nationally pure so-called branches that are usually anti-liberal, clerical, anti-Yugoslav, anti-socialist. There are also workers' gymnastic societies, which they have quite a bit clashes with. And there are also Catholic youth associations of Oral and Oral who become their enemies also later. So to conclude, and sorry that I'm taking a longer time. So there was obviously a number of considerable number of civil servants involved in Sokol. And again, most of them were mayors, especially in Cisleithania. They used Sokol to promote their alternative vision of political modernity, mobilize youth, and shift their loyalties away from the Habsburg state. The differences between Cisleithania and Transleithania seem to confirm the claims that were stated in the secondary literature that I reviewed at the beginning in terms of political culture, and further research needs to be conducted in terms of influence of religious institutions and thought, cultural and social milieu of the actors and their intellectual output, which I plan to do for this publication, for sure. Thank you for tolerating this long presentation.